would be about. We are talking about general orders and tactics for the police department, generally focused around item 95 from the most recent council meeting on June 11th. As I often do when I am fortunate to be the chair, just a quick technology check-in for everybody. I will be muting you if you're not muted, so don't take it personally. You can always unmute yourself when it's your turn to speak, but it's usually best to stay muted while others are speaking so we can minimize the audio feedback. I can see everybody on my screen at once. So if you want to add something to the conversation, you can just kind of wave your hand, and I will be calling on folks to speak in order. Given the number of folks in our conversation, it's probably best to follow the council's normal practice where you let the chair call on you to engage through the conversation. That helps prevent folks from speaking over each other. This is a special meeting of the committee. We are doing this as a workshop with members of the community and staff at the city, specifically in this case, a few of our frontline officers who will be engaging in this conversation. Unlike normal council committee meetings and certainly council meetings, this is not a conversation designed to be between council members. We want to facilitate and listen. This is more of a listening exercise for council members. I know that those who are not in the meeting formally are also watching and will be able to watch the archive of this meeting on atxn.tv. So the point of our meeting today, very specific. Where I want us to stay is talking about the police tactics and methods outlined in item 95 from June 11th. This is not a conversation about what tactics or issues have occurred in the last month. This is not going back and looking at should that have been done a certain way. We are staying focused in this conversation on what appropriate tactics are moving forward. And that's an important detail because I want us to stay focused on the types of policy and orders and tactics as we seek to explore an improved model, and to do so today with officers in the conversation. We have 4 APD officers with us and 4 community experts who each bring their own perspective and who bring an expertise to the conversation. And as I said before, council members who are on the call, and I see the Mayor Pro Tem has joined us. It is absolutely your right in any committee or council meeting to ask questions, but I would ask you to defer any questions you have to allow our panelists to engage in the conversation. I will be merely facilitating as chair of the committee. So the other thing today, and then I'll let our panelists introduce themselves. This is not a committee meeting or a workshop where we are going to answer hard questions. That is not the objective today. What we are looking at are the hard questions that have been posed by council action in their resolution, and to daylight where there is already agreement, and to daylight where there might be challenges in implementation, so that the hard choices that come later, choices that are always made by the chief or the manager or the council, that those decisions can be made in a well-rounded way, having elevated all the thoughts and concerns to the forefront so that everyone knows exactly where we're going and what we're up to. And of course, just as a limitation of time and space, it would be great to have 20 officers and 20 community experts at this conversation, but I'm thankful for the 8 folks who have agreed to participate in this conversation today, which to my knowledge is fairly unprecedented for the city. We don't normally convene meetings in this kind of workshop fashion, but as many of us have been saying, the common practice is no longer appropriate. This is an uncommon moment. So with that, I want to invite our officers to introduce themselves, and I will call on you and try to keep it brief so we can get to the substance of our conversation today. Sergeant Crumrine, would you like to begin?
Yes, Sergeant Mike Crumrine, with APD for about 20 years, 33 years total, working on 34 as law enforcement officer, one of the supervisors for the SRT team. bunch of different experience doing a variety of different things in the department over many years. Most of my experience on the investigative side of the house has been dealing with violent crime. So that's what I bring to the table, but we're keeping it short. So there you go.
Thank you, Sergeant Crumrine. Officer Villareal.
Yeah, Thomas Villareal, 14-year officer. Worked patrol for 10.5 years, worked Riverside, worked evenings and nights, worked downtown on 6th Street, night shift, worked Runberg and Lamar on a night shift. Currently the vice president of the APA and work full-time at the association. Was a hostage negotiator for a few years. Volunteered about 5.5 years of my time as an SRT member as well. So excited to be a part of the conversation and very thankful to you, Jimmy, that you have included us in the conversation.
Thank you, Officer. Corporal Johnson.
Yeah, Marcos Johnson. I've been a police officer for about 11 years. 8 of that has been with the Austin Police Department. I currently worked in the Henry sector, which is the Riverside, Pleasant Valley area of town. I'm a supervisor there. I've done a number of things at APD. I've worked in organized crime for 3.5 years. Prior to this, I was a district representative in Edward sector, which is, I believe, Councilmember Cassar's area of town just before I promoted. So just a wealth of knowledge on different things I've done, tactical things that I've experienced with, and glad to be here.
Thank you. Officer Jackson. Nope, you had it there for a second. Hold on. You're not. There you go.
Good. All right. Officer Jackson, I've been with the Austin Police Department for about 10 years. I'm actually born and raised in Austin, and I grew up in East Austin, St. John's area, and Manor-Rogge. So not only, did I become an officer to help people, but also to represent my community. I've done work patrol in the area where I grew up with. I done Metro TAC, and we're currently working as a district representative for Edward Sector.
Thank you, Officer. Also of note, Councilmember Tovo, who is not in the meeting, has let me know that she is watching on ATXN, just to note that. All right, so we have 4 folks who I have described as community experts, but we'll let them describe themselves. Why don't we start with Ms. Agrawal?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Rahki. I organize with Measure here in Austin, which is a Black-led data activism nonprofit trying to mobilize communities to solve social disparities.
Great. Ms. Pinon?
Hi, my name is Adriana Pinon. I'm a policy counsel and senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Texas. I have, throughout my legal career, have been working for the ACLU first in 2007 at the NYCLU and now at the ACLU of Texas. And in both places have focused on police reform work, both at a policy level, but also litigating cases that involve these issues.
You, Mr. Webb.
The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And before I moved to Austin about 25 years ago, I was a medic in the Army. So I have some knowledge of use of force.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Webb. And Ms. Laurin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks. My name's Jennifer Laurin. I am a professor of law at the University of Texas School of Law. I've taught there since 2009. I teach criminal law, upper level criminal procedure, a course on law enforcement oversight, and my research and writing is sort of generally, among other things, in the area of policing and law enforcement oversight.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a pretty great set of panelists today. And like I started in the beginning, we're going to use item 95 from the June 11th council meeting as our framework for the conversation. There are a number of different tactics and orders that are included in that resolution. In some cases, they are noted as prohibited as a matter of council policy. In some cases, they are noted to be limited to certain types of situations. But our objective today is not to relitigate any prior use of these tactics, but to think through and to hear from officers when they have felt those tactics were useful in those situations, to hear from our community experts what they've seen in their own research or in other communities. And ultimately, like I said, we're not going to come to a final conclusion. The adopted resolution is ultimately the policy of the council, but as is always the case, the council passes resolutions and then the manager has to implement them. So we're trying to get to the heart of the matter of how these implementing procedures might be challenged in the future. So to begin, let's start just from the top. Number one on that item is use of tear gas. Sergeant Crumrine, would you talk about, since you are involved in the SRT team, would you explain a little bit about when you've, how you have implemented this as a tactic, or how you feel it's been useful in certain situations? Or your thoughts generally. Don't feel like I have to box you in.
Sure.
Oh gosh.
As far as using,
We're not getting your audio, Mike, but you're not muted, so I'm not sure.
can you hear me now?
No.
Really?
Jimmy,
You can hear him?
I can
Oh
hear
gosh,
him
is
here.
my headphones aren't working.
Okay.
Oh no.
Um,
Oh man. Okay.
so
All right.
do you want me to?
We're gonna pivot back to the other tool.
Hang on.
This is awesome that it's happening to Jimmy, by the way.
Can anybody hear me?
We got you. Can you hear me,
Why
Jimmy?
can't I hear anybody else?
Can y'all hear me, Jimmy? Can you hear me?
Unbelievable.
I think the rest of us can hear you, but Councilmember Flanagan
I can't.
can't. And because
How on earth am I?
he's the one
Can you
tech
hear
on
me?
council, it's-
And I can't hear anybody else. Hold on.
Is there,
Let me
Greg,
speak.
do you want to put in the chat
Still nothing.
for you to, aren't you the vice chair?
Yeah, I want to give Councilmember Flanagan.
Councilmember Casar, will you go ahead and lead the meeting for a moment?
That sounds good. Mr. Crumrine, go ahead.
Thank you, Councilman. So in regards to CS or tear gas, as it's commonly used or known as. So as far as SRT, all of us have been exposed to it. All of us have been trained on how to use it and when to use it. So how, to answer your question, when there would be occasions that we would use it and why. So if we need to clear a large area, you got to consider, how am I going, like what we were faced with was the shutdown of 35. How are we going to get people off of 35? Because that artery can't stay shut down. If the decision is made that artery can't stay shut down because it's a major artery for the city of Austin, what are our options? We could physically try to remove people. That takes quite a bit more resources than what we would have available to us, first off. Secondly, anytime we're using physical force against somebody else, there is always the potential that the other individual is going to get hurt, and or the officers are going to get hurt as well. That is kind of the last thing that we wish to do. So before we ever deploy CS gas, we give numerous warnings that it's going to be deployed. The reason for that, quite frankly, is hopefully people would say, I don't want to deal with that. I am going to leave and get out of here before this gets deployed. Which, if that works, then that solves the issue, right? We clear the area. Nobody doesn't have to be deployed. Nobody gets harmed. The long-term effect of somebody being exposed to tear gas, there is always a potential that somebody with a breathing problem could be exasperated by the use of tear gas. That's always the possibility. However, the long-term side effects of being exposed to CS gas is very minimal. It clears away pretty quickly. It is an irritant. It is uncomfortable, but for the vast majority of individuals, it is not something that causes any long-term damage to them in any different ways. So when we are faced with a situation where we have to clear a large area as quickly as possible with the least possible amount of damage done to anybody, CS gas would be an option for us moving forward. So when we usually deploy it, before we ever deploy it, if you want me to go through kind of the sequence of how that works, I can go through that. We deployed it once on Sunday, the very first Sunday, and the effect of that in the future, when people wanted to shut down 35, and they did shut down 35, we didn't have to deploy it again. Simply the threat of us deploying it again was enough to move the crowd. So there's some other advantages to that moving forward. So those are some of the pros. Those are some of the cons. I know I'm talking very, very generic in moving forward, but that's actually one of the things that we don't want to do unless it's absolutely necessary, and we do not deploy it. We did not deploy it during these demonstrations until ample warning was given on numerous occasions, telling individuals what would happen before it was ever actually deployed. We don't do this without giving fair warning, if at all possible, and we certainly had the ability to do that on Sunday.
All right, so thank you y'all for, can everybody hear me now? Wave if you can hear me, because I can hear y'all again, thankfully. Thanks, Sergeant Crumrine and my staff let me know what you were saying the few moments that I was away. Thank you, Councilor Gasar, for taking over at a quick moment. So if I'm understanding correctly, that there's kind of a sequence of events of warning and kind of notification of a crowd before that tactic is used. And again, I'm not so concerned today about talking about why it may have been used before, but just the kind of what is the sequence that a certain tactic might be used. Then it sounds like there's a separate question specifically about blocking I-35, and at what point is our policy that should be escalated in order to clear the roadway, or at what point are we comfortable with protests shutting down an arterial road? And that's not necessarily a conversation we're going to get into today. There's kind of two components to that. Any of our other folks want to weigh in on kind of that sequence of steps that Sergeant Crumrine laid out? Well, you shut him down, Mike.
Well, I didn't. What I wanted to convey is the one thing that I have learned about doing crowd management for as long as I've done it is just as in so much that we have to do in law enforcement, you have to have a wide tool belt. And maybe that's not the right analogy. Some people may not want to use that word, but we have to have multiple options of what to do given different things. Life is complicated. Every situation that we deal with is never all the same. So you need to have a variety of options at your disposal if the other things that you have tried have not. We would love to come up on 35 or whatever and explain to people, we need y'all to move because of X. And here's the reasons why you're committing a criminal act. We need you to move, and people comply with that. But if they, sometimes they do, quite often they don't. If they don't, then what are the various different levels that we have that are available to us? And CS just happens to have been one of the options that we had, which I know it doesn't look good, but as far as a lasting long-term effect on an individual compared to impacting them with other munitions or anything else, it is much less creating, it will not create, for the majority of individuals, a lasting injury. And that is what we want. We don't want to do that if at all possible.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So there is a ton of evidence and data out there that supports the fact that tear gas is long-term harmful in the long term to people. It can cause people to be more susceptible to the flu, pneumonia, and other illnesses. So CS basically activates a specific pain receptor in your body. It's the same one that's triggered when you eat wasabi, except CS is like 100,000 times more strong than when you eat wasabi. And what happens is it degrades the mucous membranes in your cells, which leaves you more susceptible to catching diseases, especially given the current pandemic. We personally think that tear gas should be banned because it leaves people more at risk of contracting coronavirus.
So I think there's two pieces of that, and then I'll come to you, Ms. Pinon. So I think there's, if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, there's kind of tactics under a pandemic, but then also generally tactics. And what I'm hearing you say, Ms. Agrawal, is that in no cases does it work well, especially not during a pandemic, but generally it still causes this other issue that there's data showing a long-term impact.
Yeah, it can lead to increased susceptibility for any respiratory disease, but especially given the current situation, coronavirus is the one that we're most concerned with.
Of course, and we're making decisions both for pandemic time and for long time. So we want to make sure we're thinking about both halves of that. Ms. Pinon.
So I think one thing that also needs to be recognized, cognizant of the fact that there is a range of crowd control weapons that can be used, tear gas or CS gas, however we want to refer to it, chemical irritant, right, by its very nature is indiscriminate, such that it will impact like young people, old people, people who are peaceable, people who might be more vocal, right? There is no way to tailor it so that it is targeted, understanding that it still might be on the less lethal, harmful scale, on the lesser end, though still harmful, as my co-panelists have pointed out. It also harms everyone that it touches, irrespective of what that individual is doing at that moment. And Sergeant Crumrine, I think you mentioned the particular behavior, right? You were engaged, part of the notice, you're engaged in unlawful activity. I think part of the concern that comes from, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, I think, with crowd control weapons, right? That not everyone in a crowd in any given situation will necessarily be engaged in unlawful conduct. And thus, there wouldn't be any basis to use any level of force against a person in those situations.
So my response back to that is, you are you could be 100% correct. What we were facing was people blocking a major interstate. We'd given them warning after warning to remove themselves from that location. They did not. So our choice is either we don't do anything and let them have it for however long, which is an option, and we could consider that. But at what point, what are those parameters we set up? Are we going to allow them to have 35 shut down, like what happened in Seattle, for 5 weeks. Can this city sustain that or not? And we clearly put people on notice. You're committing an unlawful act. And we had been able earlier with smaller crowds that day to move them by advising them of that, and they moved. That particular incident, we had been advising them, and it wasn't resolving the situation. So I know that we're all looking for whatever options would be available to us moving forward, but we still have to have some options, something, because sometimes we're going to be faced with another similar situation like this, and what would be the more appropriate thing moving forward to accomplish the goal and the mission.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part to lean into in today's conversation, Sergeant, and I'm glad that you ended on that note. And part of the reason why we've asked you and the other officers to participate is that the use of these tactics prior was policy. So this is not a kind of a going back and saying you should have done something different. That's a different conversation for a different day. This is really about, all right, well, if we're now saying as a community that's not a tactic we like, what are the options before us in a crowd control, situation, crisis, moment, whatever the word is that you want to use? The other thing that I want to just note, and I think it can color our conversation today, it seems that the tactics, it seems like the situation that officers are placed in a crowd control situation, is different when the crowd is specifically protesting police. It's a very different dynamic than just about any other kind of protest, because you then become, you're not just there to protect, you're now part of the thing. And maybe part of what we have to talk about is tactics that are different when that's the situation. Maybe another conversation for another day. Ms. Laurin.
Thanks. I won't repeat the points on the particular harms of CS that were already made, but I wanted to raise a sort of different line of thoughts, because Councilman Flanagan, you had said that one of the purposes of today is to sort of put out what the questions are that are raised by the items in the resolution. And I think that the types of questions that I think about on this issue include not just sort of tear gas in or out, but a kind of broader framing that actually everyone has pointed to in thinking about what are the harms of policing in this particular way, and under what conditions are we as a community willing to authorize those harms, right? And that's not a conversation that communities have very often, maybe even really up to now ever in policing, which I think is one of the oddities of the field. It's one of the complicating things about the job. And so I think, a big picture way of framing this is really, given the harms that will be, as Ms. Pinon said, sort of indiscriminately borne by the deployment of this. And it is relevant to say, and now, given the state of the pandemic, right, in Austin, are there any conditions under which we think as a community that there's sufficient advantages to bear those harms? Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is, well, there are a few, but we don't think that opening up a major artery is one of those benefits that would sort of outweigh the harms generated, right? Or another way of thinking about the question is, who decides? And through what process does one decide when the benefits are outweighing the harms? Sergeant Crumrine walked us through a decision-making process, and that's incredibly important. Thinking about a different design for that decision-making process is also something that should be on the table, right? You think about a place like Louisville, for example, which has gone to chief approval only for this, right? maybe something like that is a way of saying this has to be something that's done only with the highest level of deliberation, that it wouldn't be done based on the say-so of someone sort of in the heat of the moment in the field, right? That we can say that with certainty, even though we can't say with certainty that it never, ever gets used. So this is not to say that I think the right answer is not a complete ban on tear gas, right? But it's rather just to say, in debating the question of the use of this tool, having the debate in a way that says we need to take account of the harms and think about what benefits we're getting. We're certainly getting some. Are there enough? Are there enough ever? And are there enough in this particular instance?
That's great. Officer Villareal, did you have your hand up?
Yes, sir. I'm glad Ms. Laurin brought those ideas up because I agree. I've spent 10.5 years of my career here in a patrol capacity, and it's always concerned me when you have rules that are, you're always going to do this or you can never do that, because kind of like Mike alluded to earlier, like there's so many different scenarios that we send our officers into every day, and it's, I think after doing the job about 5 years, I felt really, really comfortable of saying, okay, I've got this set of tools and I'm going to show up to a call with a bunch of strangers and then try to best use my skills and my tools to get the safest resolution for everybody. And so, Ms. Laurin, I completely agree with you that and I'm happy that if the conversation doesn't happen today, that it happens another time to say, we know the risks and we know maybe rewards is not the right word, but we know, we know the why that policing has gone to use some of these tools. And then what's that balance look like? What is that? And the balance in Austin might be different than, I guarantee you the balance in Austin is different than the balance in Houston or the balance in San Antonio or in Dallas. And that's okay. We just, I think especially as a police association leader, I want the folks that we represent to know like what's expected of you, very, very clear, very concise. That way our folks can go out and do the job and do it to the high level that I know that our people can do it. Specifically in regards to the use of chemical irritants or chemical agents, I think what's fresh in everyone's mind because it probably hadn't happened in many, many years, that we saw that first weekend of the protests. I think it's important for folks to remember that that's almost an outlier in the use of CS, and it probably gets far more use in barricaded subject situations, in open air barricaded subject situations, right? So barricaded subjects where, we have someone truly barricaded inside a structure, and for whatever reason, our officers are going to eventually either go in and get that person, or we're going to coax them out of that structure. We deal with situations where we have people, we call them open air barricades, where people are armed or say they're armed or out in the open, but we're going to treat them like they're barricaded because we don't want to force a deadly force situation by pressing in too closely or too quickly. And so you almost treat it like that person's barricaded. Like I said earlier, I was a negotiator for several years on our critical incident negotiation team. Negotiated with a guy that was claiming to be armed one night, and luckily had I guess I can't call it a peaceful resolution because he ended up getting shot, but he lived, he survived. And, I think it was a situation where a guy was dealing with some very serious mental illness issues. But, situations like that where you have people that are out in the open that we're going to respond. We're not just going to leave people in this crisis situation that are claiming that they want to hurt themselves or hurt other people. We're not just going to leave them. We don't have the ability to just leave them out within the community. But as we approach those people, does the benefit of potentially taking a person into custody without having to use lethal force, does that outweigh a potential long-term, hey, I know this is going to break down your mucous membrane, and kind of like Ms. Laurin said, we might as an organization and as a community say, okay, we would rather break down your mucous membrane than be forced into a deadly force situation. So I know we're kind of hyper focused on using it in crowd control situations, but I just want everyone to recognize there's lots of other situations where the use of chemical irritants are used far more frequently than what we saw on the highway.
I think that's a very good point, officer, because the resolution does not make that distinction, but it is a valuable distinction to contemplate. Again, we're not going to pull back from adopted council resolutions today. That's not the point of this conversation, but that these conversations could be complicated, and showing the public that we are exploring those complications is the point. So I appreciate adding that perspective. Corporal Johnson, Officer Jackson, jump in at any time. Know that put your hand up. I will call on you if you want to add to anything that Sergeant or Officer Villareal has to add. Any last words on this before we move on to more use of force tactics? Okay. So in the next section on the resolution, it talks about use of deadly force, and it defines limited to situations necessary for self-defense, defense of others against a deadly threat or threat of serious bodily injuries, and no other reasonable alternatives exist. That seems like a very broad, open to interpretation statement. How if any of the officers want to weigh in, how do you feel you've been trained on use of force, this use of deadly force moment in your current training? Corporal?
Thank you. I would say that I think we're all in agreement, whether you're a police officer or not a police officer, and what that specifically states. I know that Tennessee versus Garner specifically outlines, which is a Supreme Court case law that outlines how that deadly force is used in that section that you wrote there about anyone fleeing on foot or in a vehicle that doesn't pose a significant risk of death or serious bodily injury to the officers or anyone else. We're all in agreement with that. Our use of force policies dictate how our force is used and gives us situations on when it's used and how we can use that force. So it's important to recognize the Austin Police Department does have guidelines in place for that. And I think we're all in agreement with that being there, that it should only be used in those specific situations.
Officer Jackson.
Okay. I think that the Academy also does a really great job at, educating us and showing us. Obviously, we are being trained for a worst case scenario. So they try to put us through different situations to try to understand what would happen or what kind of situations would dictate. Obviously, on top of the experience you will get as an officer as you actually go and start working the streets.
I think that's interesting, the way that you framed that, officer, about a worst case scenario. And there's a separate conversation happening, a citizen review of training materials and the academy process and all that. So we don't need to go down a full path of kind of what the training academy operations and the materials look like, because that's happening separately. But kind of that balance between trained for worst case scenario, at what point is the training making a not worst case scenario look like a worst case scenario? That's been some concerns.
Includes the experience of the officers responding to those calls, because you are going to get to those calls where you think about what's going to happen. You know, you're driving and you only have seconds to make a decision as to what's going to occur. And it could be as simple as, hey, you know, the guy's going to take off running to the guy's going to pull out a gun. It could be anything. And those are the situations that, you know, you have split seconds to decide what kind of force is necessary, if any.
Yeah, I wish we had the time and the power to get into gun policy in this country, but we're definitely not getting into that today. Any comments, any further comments on this general area? I feel like there's a lot there, but I don't know where to head. Ms. Laurin.
Thanks. I have a few thoughts here. So one thing I should make clear is I have no inside knowledge of what happens in the training academy. All I can see, like anyone else in the general public, is the policy. And something that I think I might be hearing, which is interesting and good if I'm hearing it correctly, is that really actually the training given in the academy might well be consistent with sort of the words of this policy. In other words, or the words of the resolution, I'm sorry. In other words, that you know, the experience of the officers who just spoke is that they really are, you know, in sort of situationally, in sort of live, you know, in live trainings, being taught to avoid the use of deadly force and to explore reasonable alternatives, right? That deadly force is a last resort. That being said, and so if that's what the training is, that's important and great and should remain the training. That being said, it's not what the text of the current general order is by any stretch of the imagination. In other words, it's to say, to use the Tennessee versus Garner standard, right? And to use deadly force only if an officer reasonably perceives that deadly force against the officer or another is imminent, or if the officer reasonably perceives that the individual committed a crime of violence or is about to commit a crime of violence, is a more forgiving standard by design, right, than what is proposed in the council resolution. And when I say by design, that's important. I would really love to sort of beat my academic drum here and leave the council and others with the belief, to convince them of my belief, that it's really a mistake for police policy on use of force to continue to simply parrot the Supreme Court standard in Garner or in Graham, which it does in other places. And that's because when the Supreme Court said, here's how we're going to review police force, they did it with cautiousness about whether they could really dictate the tactics that are best used by police in the situations in which they find themselves. Police departments themselves are not, unlike the Supreme Court, poorly positioned to be giving clearer direction on tactics. And I think police departments, although in the past have tended, like APD, to sort of incorporate Supreme Court case law into their policies and call it a day, increasingly you do see departments moving away from that approach and requiring, as a matter of policy, that the use of deadly force not just kind of, you know, not fail, but actually do what's more optimal. You look at Camden, for example, which recently overhauled its use of force policies and went to you know, deadly force as last resort only, requirement of use of de-escalation where reasonably necessary. You look at California, right, which across the state now, its police departments are revising their policies in accordance with the change in California law, which authorizes deadly force only when necessary. So I think that this is a place to move from policy being used when reasonable to use only when necessary and no reasonable alternative. It is a move. It's important that policy say it, even if training is giving that message, in part because policy is a means of disciplining departures from that training and practice. And if you don't have a means of disciplining it, then you're not going to get compliance at the end of the day. You will in the vast majority of officers, but you won't catch the problem officers. I know I'm going on, but let me just say one last thing here, and that's that just to go back to training, right? I'm sorry, 2 points, one on policy, one on training. One is that in thinking about policy, it's important not only to be worried about the content of any particular policy, but to be worried about the entire framework, right? So in terms of questions that are on the table for implementing the resolution, in my view, it would be a real shame if what happened was in implementing this resolution, someone took this language and plunked it into the general orders and said, there's the policy, right next to all the other general orders that continue to sort of generally parrot the Garner standard and say things that are arguably in tension with this. Police need clear policy, right? As I think we've already heard. And then lastly, it would also be a mistake if the policy were to change and attention to training wasn't closely paid, because words like necessary, right? Words like reasonable alternative are not, do not mean one thing, right? Police need to be trained on what is a reasonable alternative, right? And when is it necessary? So training remains really critical.
Thank you, Ms. Laurin. And again, I want to thank our four officers for participating today, because I know it can't be easy to have a conversation like this. It can be challenging. And again, just as a reminder, we're not talking about actions being taken or training you've been given. This is about thinking about the community's conversation and how we want to move the department forward. And it just, again, my thanks to the four of you for your willingness to engage so openly in this conversation. Ms. Pinon.
One thing that I'd like to add that was touched on briefly, and just as we kind of think about these issues, I know we're focused on deadly force right now, but thinking even broader of use of force, right? Part of, I think, what we really need to be mindful of is de-escalation, right? And we've heard this a lot recently, but what sort of training on de-escalation happens is effective. And I think that, in everything like turns on the details, right? If I litigate a case, it all turns on the facts of what happened there. Was it reasonable? But we're dealing with like the constitutional floor when we are talking about Gardner and O'Connor, right? And I think what everyone right now with the discussion is really turning on is like, let's discuss not just the constitutional floor, which might eliminate liability for you, right? It eliminates liability for you if you achieve that floor. We're trying to, I think, find ways to do better, right? So that it isn't just we hit the minimum requirement. Let's try and see how we can find a way that situations, some which might be fraught from the get-go, some which might not be, right? How do we go about even what steps do we need to take, and what do we need to do to prevent the use of force in the first instance, and certainly to preventing the use of deadly force, right? And so I just wanted to kind of unpack those 2 points a bit about the Constitution being the floor, and how important de-escalation is in talking about best practices for use of force.
And de-escalation is mentioned in the resolution, a couple bullet points down. Let's move on a little bit since we're coming up on our halfway mark. The next section, the two next sections in the resolution talk about impact munitions and kind of quote less than lethal force as a tool. Seems more specific to actual devices. What are the thoughts on, and this one, unlike the tear gas item, it bifurcates. It says use of impact prohibited when exercising First Amendment rights. And then it goes on to say that the less than lethal limited to instances where, very similar to deadly force.
If I could weigh in here,
Please do.
just a little bit. So obviously, the situation that comes up is if people are exercising their First Amendment rights, which the SRT team was formed to protect people's ability to do that, where it goes or becomes an issue is when it's not just that, but then it turns into some other criminal aspects of either assaulting somebody else or creating damage to property. So at that point, I think the decision, we need to come to an understanding as a community as at what point does this get to where it's no longer somebody just expressing their First Amendment rights. Now somebody is destroying property. Now somebody is harming somebody else. And what does that look like? Like, what are those thresholds? So obviously, I think everybody on this call, I would hope everybody would agree, we can't allow people, no matter who they are, to harm others, right? You can't allow this person to go smack this person in the face. Can't happen. So how do we address that and prevent that? The less lethal munitions are an option. They're not the only option that's available to us. The beanbag rounds are good. They're used on patrol quite a bit. They've been incredibly effective on patrol, but there's various levels of that. There's the, people will call them the rubber bullets, but it's our 40 millimeter grenade launcher, which is actually a foam projectile. It's not a bullet, but our SWAT team has a different one than what we use in SRT. Theirs is more precise. Theirs is rifled. If you're familiar with ballistics, if I shoot something out of a smooth bore, like in a shotgun, as far as putting it exactly on target where I need it to be put on target, it's more challenging than if I were to have something that rifled out, right? If you understand ballistics. So going to a rifled 40 millimeter foam bullet, like what we have in SWAT, would probably be a much better weapon system for us to have moving forward. The beanbag, I've seen it being incredibly effective. It's very effective on patrol. Usually when you're dealing with somebody who may be in a mental crisis, who may be attempting to harm themselves or other, I've seen it used multiple times where people will have an edged weapon and either be attempting to harm themselves or attempting to harm somebody else. It's an effective tool to give distance between the officer and other citizens and the person who may be trying to harm themselves. But it is only effective is once it is deployed, you can send the resources in to place that person into custody themselves anymore, right? So that is a proper way to use that device moving forward. It has its applications. Obviously, if you could get a much better weapon that could be rifled and put on target, that is better than shooting something out of a smoothbore moving forward. But we would never deploy that at people who are just expressing their First Amendment rights unless individuals that are doing that are also attempting to try to harm others, and their action needs to be stopped. That was the reason that it was deployed. Does that make sense?
And I think that the resolution kind of makes that distinction where First Amendment rights does not include the destruction or harm to others, right? And so that's not what's in the First Amendment, but it has this kind of same challenge on the deadly force, where the kind of the devil's in the details in terms of defining imminent threat and serious bodily harm, and this very important distinction as we move forward through this work of when are we talking about a crowd control moment, and when are we talking about an individual call, which it seems to have very different parameters around it, where certain tactics or approaches are more or less reasonable than in a crowd.
I would agree. I think if you were trying to use beanbag rounds as a way to control a crowd, I think that's an improper weapon system for that. Is it an effective weapon system to stop a specific individual in that crowd doing something? Yes, but if you can't also put the resources out there once you have stopped that person from doing that criminal act or that harm and remove them from the fight by taking them into custody, it's not an effective tool anymore. Does that make sense?
Sure. And any other input folks want to provide on this kind of quote less than lethal? Ms. Laurin.
Thanks. So my perspective on this is sort of complicated. On the one hand, I take part of the point, and particularly the second bullet point that we're focusing on here, sort of the moving of less than lethal into essentially treating them as lethal force, right? If you sort of look at the parallel rule. I take part of the point of that, the spirit of that, in part to be, hey, let's recognize that, it's not really just like getting hit by a beanbag, when you're playing cornhole. Like, it hurts, right? And can seriously injure people, and can even under certain circumstances be lethal under certain circumstances. So I am on board with sort of the spirit of recognizing that there's a range of technologies that we sort of class for legal purposes, for policy purposes, as less than lethal, but they're not, strictly speaking. That's an important thing to recognize, to have taught, to have stated in policy. On the other hand, I worry that the sort of impetus to limit the use of these, I'll call them less than lethal weapons, might undo what I think is really the bigger picture concern, which is, in all cases, we want force to be avoided. It's like zero force, right? Ever. If there is to be any force, we want the least force that can be used. And we certainly want, in all instances, to avoid deadly force if it can't possibly be avoided. And when we talk about de-escalation, right, at least the way that de-escalation is taught, right, and trained on, de-escalation assumes that there is a range of force techniques that can be distinguished from each other and that can be used, if necessary, to avoid the more serious one, right? And we also know that the way in which non-lethal force is used, right, all the way down the continuum, affects a scenario and how that scenario might progress to possibly to the potential need to use deadly force, the perceived need to use deadly force. So what am I saying here? A few things. One, we can't divorce, as Ms. Pinon said, we can't divorce sort of deadly force from non-deadly force in thinking about what the policy is and what the training is, right? Because it's interrelated. But secondly, the caution I have here is to tell officers that they should always treat all of these non-lethal technologies as justified only when they get to the point of being able to use lethal technologies might undo the ability to effectively de-escalate certain situations, right? It might be the right thing to use a taser to create distance and time such that an individual can be disarmed rather than be killed and then disarmed. It's not to say that these aren't overused, potentially. It's not to say that the policy couldn't be better. It definitely could. But this, as written, I think could undo what I take to be the point of the exercise.
Officer Jackson, then Ms. Agrawal, then Mr. Villareal.
So policy does indicate that this is could potentially be a lethal situation, but it says that it's less than likely to. So policy does indicate that, on top of obviously us having to be aware of what a less lethal does. So those are already situations or information that's already established by the department to the officer. So we are aware of those, those potentials. Same thing with taser. We know what those, that it could cause serious injury as well, but it's also less than likely. And all those are established, obviously, in policy. But on top of that, there are drilled on to us as well.
Agrawal.
Yeah, so there's de-escalation and there's escalation avoidance, and one is much more effective than the other. In the case that I think Officer Crumrine brought up in terms of someone having a mental health crisis and where they're posing an imminent threat to themselves, that should not be we can accomplish escalation avoidance in terms of just having a separate body of mental health officers that are going out without weaponry, et cetera, not even having less lethal beanbags or anything on them. As for, I agree that what Ms. Laurin said in terms of beanbags can still be lethal. And also I think what I'm not hearing is any acknowledgement of the fact that and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm open to learning and deepening my understanding of various ammunitions and ballistics stuff, but when someone is shot by a beanbag round, it's still, to them, their brain thinks that they've been shot. This is what happened in the killing of Mike Ramos. He thought that he had been shot, and that's what prompted him to drive away. So that can also then lead to...
I just want to remind everybody, we're not here to kind of comment on things that have occurred in the past, and unfortunately, Mr. Ramos is not with us to say what he was thinking or feeling at that time. And so I just want to keep us on this good track we've been on, looking forward. Thanks.
Sure. Sorry, the facts are saying that he was shot by a beanbag round first, and then he drove away, which eventually caused the lethal shot to be fired, which eventually ended his life. So there is a chain of events that can take place once a less lethal force is used that then can cause lethal force to be used.
Thanks. And we're going to continue having these workshops. I think our next one will contemplate what some of these alternative services look like in other communities. So there's a lot of kind of complexity about how you roll those out. And so we're going to have another time to dig into that. But I'm glad that you brought up that, as several folks have. Officer Villareal.
Thank you, Jimmy. So going back to the first bullet point, about using impact conditions on somebody who's just exercising their First Amendment rights. I think it's important for everyone to kind of have a good understanding of what happens after you use force. I was when I was a rookie, I worked evening shift and night shift down in Henry sector. We had the river to Ben White from Congress Avenue out to Del Valley, and at the time we were very, very, very busy, and worked the last murder of one calendar year, the first murder of next calendar year, all within 1 4-day working period. Have worked tons and tons of violent crimes as a patrol officer, and when you're put in those situations, you're put into situations where you have to use force. It's a nature of the job, unfortunately, and sometimes. And so I only say that to say that, unfortunately, as a patrol officer, I've documented my use of force many times, and I want you guys to have a good understanding of what happens on the back end when things calm down, when everyone's back to being as safe as possible. What happens? So officers are required to document their force, and that goes off for a review. And so understanding that it's going to be reviewed by 2 different commanders. It's going to be reviewed at your first line supervisor level. It's going to be reviewed at the lieutenant level. It's going to be reviewed by your initial commander. It's going to go off for a peer review. Some of these issues go to a force review board to review at a higher level to say, okay, are we seeing any patterns or are we seeing our folks or not, remembering this one little nugget within policy. So specifically, right, like if someone were to use an impact munition on somebody solely exercising their rights, we have a checks and balances system to deal with those problems. Our policy talks about, like, yes, we use the objectively reasonable standard, but we also make sure that, was that use of force necessary in that moment? So not only was it reasonable, but was it necessary? So I want to kind of lay that out there so folks understand the process a little bit. I very much agree with what Ms. Laurin said earlier in regards to that second bullet point. If we have almost mirroring language on when I can use deadly force or when I can use less lethal force, we're going to create problems. Some of those problems will manifest themselves into situations where officers get hurt. Some of those problems will manifest to where citizens get hurt. And I think that having a clear distinction so officers understand, when is it appropriate? When is it appropriate for me to grab you and throw you to the ground? When's it appropriate for me to punch you? When's it appropriate for me to hit you with a stick or shoot you with a taser or take my taser and just drive stun you so you have just pain compliance? When is it appropriate for me to escalate to deadly force? I think there's a whole nother conversation that we can have to say, when talking about deadly force, which weapon system is the right weapon system to take into potential deadly force situations? So there's a lot there to unpack. The other thing, and it's too deep of a conversation probably to have today, but I think it's important that at some point that we unpack the force continuum that the Austin Police Department kind of operates under is the DRRM, right? The dynamic response resistance model that, for years we talked about like a ladder where, your officer presence was your first kind of step in the ladder. And then you could use verbal commands, and then you could use, open hand soft controls, and then open hand hard controls. And there was this idea among some people that you had to climb the ladder. I needed to do this, I needed to do that. And what was happening was when you had officers that would come into a situation that would immediately go to the appropriate level of force, some folks would say, wait, time out, we have this ladder, why aren't you going up the ladder? And at times there's just not enough time to go up the ladder. And so, when our department changed the DRRM, I think it was a change for the best because it allows people to come in at the appropriate level. If coming in threatening to tase somebody and being willing to use a taser to resolve a situation is appropriate, then we should allow our officers to come in at that level, recognize that, yes, we want you to de-escalate. I was having a conversation yesterday at my 5-year-old's birthday party with some friends of ours. And I said, we were talking about work, and I was talking about talking my way out of problems. I've got a degree in communications from UT. And, when I was a hostage negotiator, I loved the challenge of trying to resolve situations with my words. That's why I went to the school to begin with. And, there's been lots of situations in my career where I didn't, it's like, I don't want to get punched in the mouth today. And if I can talk my way out of this, if I can take a minute and give myself the time and distance with my words, then let's do that. Not everything needs to be, rushed into. And so, just understanding that the vast majority of your officers, once they get on the streets and once they're with an FTO and once they're learning the job, I think we have the ability to explain to people, right, that yes, we have these options, and sometimes the threat of that option is all that you have to do. And we can continue to de-escalate. I was part of the APA's leadership at the time that our de-escalation policy was formally enacted. And I remember having a group conversation with some activists, and I told them, I said, de-escalation is COPN 101. That's every single call that you go to. If you remotely know what you're doing, you should be de-escalating from the moment that you arrive until you leave. It should be, I used to tell rookies on our shift when I worked up in Edward sector, because I had a pretty junior shift. I was a senior guy on a junior shift, and I would tell them, guys, your number one goal when you get there is to slow everything down, calm everything down, and then figure out what's my problem, work through my problem as safely as possible. So I think it's important for folks to recognize that these are things that happen regularly as a course of just working the job. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it back to you, Jimmy, is I have issue with everything being lumped into this one bullet point, and everything being lumped into this one bullet point, and it being really reserved for deadly force situations. There are definite times where in my opinion, it's appropriate to use the taser, because it's going to help an officer to quickly take someone into custody, particularly in situations where they might be by themselves. Pepper spray. I hate pepper spray. Working down on 6th Street gave me a hate for pepper spray that I didn't think that I had possible, because I've been exposed to it so many times. And I can count on one hand the number of people that I have tried to pepper spray, some of them very unsuccessfully because I used it so little. And so, but without understanding, having the option to use it in certain situations, I think is very important. And I will tell you right now that it's very tough for me to even think about a situation that would be a deadly force situation where I would remotely go for pepper spray. And then the last line in that bullet of having all reasonable alternatives being exhausted, it goes back to the DRRM and I don't know. Realistically, and again, Jimmy, like we talked about the other day, I'm happy that we're having these conversations, because I think it's important for you and your fellow council members to understand that I don't know that that's reasonable. I don't know it's reasonable for us to tell an officer, you have to do everything else before you decide to tase somebody. You have to do everything else before you decide to use a less lethal round. I think that we can talk very, specifically, Rahki earlier brought up, talking about, these mental health calls, like, and Rahki, I wrote down, de-escalation versus escalation avoidance, because that's a phrase that I had never heard before. Right. And it's something I want to dive into. In my opinion, that's where we should be spending our time, trying to understand, do we not want to use force? Do we not want to respond to these calls? Do we not want to, how do we unpack that? But saying, you have to do everything else in your power before you use this less lethal option is my fear is that it will push officers to not use less lethal options. And the reason that those options exist is because people in the community were tired of having lots of negative outcomes, and they went to business to say, how can we give officers more time, more distance, and the ability to utilize cover better to lower the number of negative outcomes? And I don't want us as a community to regress to where I have my person, I show up, I'm an agent of the government, I'm Officer Villareal, and then I have my words, and then I have nothing else other than deadly force.
Well, thank you, Officer Villareal. That definitely felt like some real talk, and I really appreciate you being direct. It's not always easy to do in a forum that is being broadcast. Part of this conversation is also for the public, so that it's, in addition to this conversation, there's obviously work happening in the city manager's office and working groups convening and all that stuff. And we have our Office of Police Oversight on this call, kind of to be visible and present to this conversation. And I think something you laid out a lot there, Thomas. The one thing I do want to kind of note that I thought was really important is the systems of oversight and discipline that exist do rely upon the policy matching the training, kind of to Ms. Laurin's point, because if the policies don't match the training, then you find folks violating the training but not being able to be disciplined because of the policy. And so you end up in this kind of like tough spot. And so getting these things aligned is definitely an important part of this work. I think Ms. Pinon and then Corporal Johnson had their hands up.
Now, my point was brought up in what earlier in the conversation by what Ms. Agrawal had said.
All right, Corporal Johnson.
Yeah, couple of things. I know we've had this long drawn out conversation about this, so excuse me if I forget some of my points here, but I think one thing our department has to continue to do, and which they do a great job at, but we have to continue to do going forward, is recognizing the limitations we have with our less lethal options. We do recognize that those less lethal options, if they're used incorrectly or not used in the proper manner, can cause serious bodily injury or can potentially be fatal. So the department recognizes that, and we have, for example, the taser. There's a specific distance that's recommended, and then also a specific place that we're supposed to aim that taser to use it effectively. And same thing goes for the less than lethal shotgun. This is the first time I've seen it used in a crowd control type situation like this. When I speak with some of the officers who have been at APD for that were probably here back in the early 2000s, a lot of them said that this is the first time we've seen protest to this magnitude. And so those less lethal options, like the less lethal shotgun, have been used in other situations out on patrol. So I think this is the first time we get to see, hey, we have some limitations with how it's being used as a crowd control in a crowd control situation. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the understanding de-escalation. And I know that term gets tossed around a whole lot, but I think we need to recognize that we have to have some type of working understanding of what de-escalation means, because I think it means something different to every person. And what I mean by that is, take, for example, let's say an officer goes to a call and there's a man with a knife, and the officer has enough time, and let's say he's talking with the guy, he's communicating, and he realizes, hey, we hit the limitation with speaking, we have to act, or he's going to either hurt someone or hurt himself. And let's say he's coming towards the officer, and the officer decides to deploy his taser, it works effectively, and he's able to disarm that subject. Well, that could have potentially been a deadly force situation, and the officer was able to de-escalate that and turn that into a situation where that person is still alive and no one's injured. And that's just a hypothetical. But to us, that's de-escalating that situation where it could have potentially been a deadly force situation. So I think we have to realize that based on the call and based on the situation, de-escalation might be something a little different. Now, if, say, that individual was having a mental breakdown and the officer shows up and he points the gun and this guy's unarmed, totally different situation there. Now we can say, okay, de-escalation here wasn't pulling out the gun. In fact, you may have escalated the situation, given the circumstances. So I think that we have to look at it from that scope and understanding that de-escalation is not always going to be showing up and, hey, let's talk to this guy. Like if we have an active shooter situation, if officers are showing up and there's an active shooter inside of a high school or a middle school, are we expecting the officers to go in there and say, hey, just talk to us while he's firing and pulling the trigger, or are we expecting those officers to go in there and stop the threat? So I think that we have to kind of keep that in mind when we talk about de-escalation, that we have to look at what situation we're in. And I hate speaking in general terms, but it's really hard to kind of define specific things and say, hey, we're going to have a policy in place for every single thing. And then just to touch on what Officer Villareal talked about as far as the policies and procedure in place for our use of force or response to resistance investigations, whenever an officer does use force, he's correct that part of my job is to review that force. And so at my level, I'm looking at all the body cam videos, I'm interviewing the officers, I'm interviewing witnesses, I'm interviewing the suspects or the individuals that the force was applied towards, and I'm making sure that this was all within compliance. So this takes several days because I have to review all the available video and evidence, read reports, make sure that everything lines up with what happened and what was consistent with our policies and procedure. And then that gets sent to the lieutenant. The lieutenant reviews that and it gets sent to the commander, and then it goes back and gets reviewed again. So there's checks and balances in place. And what I've seen our department do in times is if we have a situation where we're like, hey, officer, we were starting to see a trend with officers using this potential situation to use force, and we feel like it's not necessary, the department pushes out training, or they send out emails or memos and saying, hey, we need to change this effective immediately, or we need to stop having our officers kind of make these decisions and do these things that are creating that type of force in those situations. So there's a lot that goes on in the back end during those situations.
Thank you, Corporal. Mr. Webb, I think I can see your hand is up. Sorry if I've missed you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. The bullet point I want to focus on is one that says general orders requiring officers to intervene to stop improper or excessive use of force by the fellow officers should be appropriately enforced. I think a lot of people in the community would be concerned about that wording there where it says should be appropriately, because first, we're thinking, how are they defining appropriately? And instead of should, why not will be or absolutely will be enforced? Because from the perspective of the community, it's not a training issue, it's not a funding issue. The issue is that people are getting away with violations and not being punished. Officer Johnson brought up the point that he has to review, the cam footage. We have instances where camcorder's off, it's purposely turned off. So there's no visuals to review. So I would like to hear from the officers, their response to my concerns about this particular bullet point.
Corporal Johnson.
Yeah, I think what you're starting to see now, a lot more, what I've noticed is the department starting to have a lot bigger of a, I guess, for lack of a better term, a hard stance on body cameras not being on during those situations. When we first got them, it was it's a new tool, so everyone's trying to get used to, I need to turn this on, or making sure that whenever we open our patrol car door, that camera is on. But not to get deep in the weeds, whenever those cameras are off or they've been purposely turned off by the officer, that camera, it holds so much data as far as how much the battery percentage was, when it was last docked, when it was last turned on, if it was recording or not. So they can definitely dive into that and determine if this thing was accidentally turned off, or was it knocked off, or did the officer just fail to turn it on? And I think that the consequences now is almost like there's a zero tolerance just based on everything that we're seeing nationally and everything that we're dealing with. We want to make sure that we are still holding ourselves accountable in those situations. And we have policies in place when those cameras are not turned on, when that stuff happens. And to your first point about officers having to intervene whenever we see an officer using excessive force, one of the most interesting things I thought I went through in the police academy, and it wasn't anything that they kind of tell you beforehand, but we had this one scenario where we, because we do a lot of those, what we call role play, we had a scenario where we had to go into a room and it says, hey, you're responding as a backup officer for another officer who's out on the subject. Well, the door is closed, and the moment you open the door, you see the officer on top of an individual, and that individual is obviously displaying signs that he is giving up. He's not fighting the officer, is willing to cooperate, but the officer was told, because it's role play, continue to use excessive force, and it's designed to see what the officer's going to do. Obviously, I went in there and I don't think it had anything to do with me having prior law enforcement experience, but as soon as I observed that, I immediately went over there and grabbed the officer and separated him from the individual and said, enough is enough. And then they stopped the role play, and then okay, what did you see? What was your thought process? What are your next steps? Obviously, you report this, you report the officer, and you recognize that this officer was using more force than that was necessary. And that's something that I would want to say that the department is continuously having our cadets go through as a role play option. Now, worst case scenario, we have situations still to this day where officers are engaged in those situations, and whether it was a purposeful excessive force, or if it was something that a witness officer wasn't sure was purposeful, we have those situations. And again, that's where it comes back to the supervisors and the command staff looking at all the information and during their investigation to determine whether that was appropriate or not, and certainly taking swift action if it isn't.
Sergeant Crumrine, did you have your hand up?
I did. Corporal touched on it, which was a scenario. I went through the academy in 2001. Actually, I graduated a month to the day before 9/11 happened. Was the day that I graduated from the Austin Police Academy. And that scenario had been in the curriculum even going back that far. In addition to that, our policy says two parts. Any criminal act that is done by an officer is investigated by our Special Investigation Units, or SIU unit. And then any violation of policy is investigated by our Internal Affairs. So two different things. Our policy reads that should an officer at any point know that an officer has committed a criminal act and fails to report that immediately to SIU, that officer is subject to being disciplined up to and including termination. If an officer witnesses a policy violation committed by another individual and they too fail to report that to their chain of command or to Internal Affairs, they are subject to being disciplined up to and including termination, depending upon what the circumstances were. So, Marcus had talked about the fact that these videos are recorded all the time. Granted, when we first came out with these body-worn cameras, they were a new tool. We didn't always, we had to figure out how they worked. We now have them where I'm unaware of a situation where multiple officers will go out to a scene and there not be a video of it at some point. So that captures it. And as a supervisor, when I was on patrol, I'm a supervisor now of an investigative bureau, but I review my officers' body-worn camera. And if they fail to do what they're supposed to do as far as violating in a violation of policy or a violation of law, then I am compelled to bring forward an Internal Affairs investigation and or an SIU investigation. And that's something that's very, very strict. So I wanted y'all to know that there's these checks and balances. I am not saying that there's never going to be a human error. And I am not saying that we cannot improve. There's always ways that we can be better. But I wanted to put this out for context with everybody, that there are these systems in place. Thomas had talked about it before. Marcus just talked about it here a little bit a second ago. There is these systems that are in place to guarantee, to do the very best we can to make sure that everything is covered. We can always be better. We can always be better at learning how to de-escalate. We can always be better at communicating. There's no doubt about that. But there are some systems, sir, that Mr. Webb, that are currently in place, and we are compelled by policy should we feel that somebody has used excessive force, that we must intervene. That's already established within our general orders.
Thank you, Sergeant. We are in the last roughly 20 minutes, and I think the use of force section is probably the densest part, but I do want to make sure we at least touch briefly on the other parts of the resolution. The number 3 is chokehold use, which I understand is already prohibited by department policy. And so that kind of falls into the implementation question that we're kind of circling around on all these items. You know, what happens if an officer violates the policy if it's already the policy? The military equipment item, this is a fairly long section that tries to speak to the use of military equipment. Mr. Webb, I know you've got the military background. I'm wondering if you have any insight on this.
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Anybody else want to jump in on this? Ms. Pinon. There you go.
Sorry. So I think one of the things that I want to raise with respect to military equipment, I guess maybe there's more than one. One is just the amount of money that municipalities get from the federal government, right, in grants. And we did a study, and I was just double checking the date. It was June of 2014 that actually pulled data that Austin was given by the federal government for these more it comes in two forms. It can either be to compensate officers for overtime pay or for actual weaponry, right? And the amount was pretty staggering. I'm trying to pull that through. I think it was 2.2 million for 2 years, which when we think about what the role of police should be, this influx of funds for these much more aggressive, not only in what they do, but even in like the signals that they send to the community, right? I think it's important to keep these things in mind as we discuss, like, what is the role of police? Are they combating the cities that they are meant to protect and serve, or are they guardians? And this militarization, I think, is part of that militarization, that turning the guardians into warriors, that I think everyone has a desire to kind of scale back. So I do think it's important that the use of military grade weapons be, I would say that I don't know what sort of use like a tanker car, for example, would have in the city of Austin, whether any of them would ever be appropriate for use in a municipality, right? Where we're talking about officers meant to protect and serve the community versus Mr. Webb, who's been in the military, whose mission is, right, to combat. So I think it's a very important area to focus on. And I think how and when, if at all, it should ever be used, I would think that sort of funding should just be eliminated, right? But I think that's something that's very important to discuss about how we then transform our police department to be more of, to protect and serve, to be the guardians.
And I think it's important to note that particular provision of the resolution talks about reducing to the greatest extent possible and future contracts requiring specific notice to the council before they're approved. That's a little different than the other provisions. Corporal Johnson.
So I'm kind of in agreement with you. The less things that we have to carry and the less things that we have to have that create that kind of military mindset or militant mindset out in the community, the better, because it makes us more approachable. I'll give you a little bit about my childhood and growing up. I didn't have a pristine childhood or grow up in the nicest areas of town. I grew up in some pretty bad areas, and there were people at times that were in my neighborhood that had better guns than the police did. And just knowing my childhood, my upbringing, and the areas that I grew up in Florida, you would almost think that officers were showing up to calls or showing up there in the community, and they were outgunned in a sense. Taking it a step further, before I even became a police officer, and even while I was in college, we watched a few things. There was a bank robbery that occurred in LA. There was a situation that even Columbine, we discussed Columbine at length with the type of firepower that was available to the individuals in that situation, and how it was used, and how the officers, the police response was, and how if their response was different, they could have saved more lives. Because years ago, maybe more than 2 decades ago, the rules of engagement were to wait for SWAT when you had situations like that. And I guess I'm referring to military type equipment like rifles, or maybe the vest, some of the heavy carrier vests that we utilize, and even maybe some of the armored vehicles. I know that the University of Texas has an armored vehicle that they utilize. It's called an MRAP. But when they didn't have those tools, and I remember the LA bank robbery back in the late 90s, those officers were outgunned. All of them had pistols and shotguns, and the guys that were shooting at them had AK-47s and thousands of rounds. Fast forward into today's realm, where we've seen police shooting, or not police shootings, but shootings that active shooter type situations. I was a police officer at the University of Texas when Colton Tooley showed up at the Eric Castaneda Library, and I responded to that situation. So seeing that if the university did not have those tools necessary to try to make sure that we had the opportunity to stop that situation, we're putting ourselves in dire situations now. The department has rules in place, like obviously officers are not going to show up to a family disturbance or show up to a simple theft call or something of that nature with a rifle slung and full military gear on. Obviously that's a problem, and that's not the image that we want to portray out to the public in those situations. But a lot of that equipment is utilized for situations where we have to protect ourselves in order to protect the public. And just recently we had the Austin bomber here. I'm not sure all of the logistics and what military grade equipment the SWAT team used. Maybe someone else can speak on to that knowledge. But I'm pretty sure without all of those resources, that situations like that would become much more difficult for us to handle.
That's an interesting point, and kind of with all of the things we're digging into, devil's in the details, and you end up talking about one thing, and if you're not really careful about how you frame that, it sounds like we're talking about it being used all the time versus the types of incidences that in Austin are extremely rare, and then how do you manage what's the chain of command about the use of those things, right? That's all the level of detail that this conversation is helping frame, both for the public and for the managers we do the work. Ms. Agrawal, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to point to some data. So in 2018, Princeton came out with a study from their Department of Politics that showed that militarization of police forces fails to enhance both police safety and public safety, and it fails to reduce crime, but it does negatively impact the public's perception of police and police reputation in the community. Also, it found that there was no evidence that obtaining or deploying a SWAT team reduces local crime rates, or that it lowers the rates in which officers are killed or assaulted.
Interesting data to dig into. Officer Jackson.
So when you are needing a SWAT team, the purpose is not there to prevent crime. The crime's already happening. So that report could, in theory, be biased, because when you have SWAT, SWAT's there to respond to a call that's already been in place. They're not there at no point to deter crime from happening.
I think it's an interesting point as we do this work moving forward about what parts of our budget we think will reduce crime rate versus what parts of the budget respond to crime that's occurring. And those are very different questions, and different tactics and different systems are going to have to be in place. There's a lot of really interesting stuff to dig into. Officer Villareal.
So I'll start by saying I'm really happy to see that, what you pointed to earlier, that this kind of subsection 4 talking about military equipment doesn't outlaw it, doesn't prohibit it. It says, hey, y'all, the council, want to be made aware of these purchases. I talked to some of our SWAT, one of our more senior SWAT snipers earlier today, to pick their mind about specifically military equipment. And it's interesting, I would say the vast majority of the military equipment that we have at the police department is stuff that the city has purchased. The vast majority of the stuff that we've gotten from the DMRO is, you know, I know we got a bunch of like optics and you know, it's a difference of, hey, Councilmember Flanagan, I want you to be okay with us spending hundreds of $1,000s on optics. So when our officers do have to use deadly force, that we're being as efficient as possible versus, hey, we have these surplus optics that are potentially going to come from the military to save the city some money. Ms. Pinon, you made a comment about overtime dollars, and I'm aware of, you know, especially like within our organized crime division, some of our folks are able to spend some overtime, or we're able to spend overtime dollars that are given to us from the federal government. But I guess I don't find the link between this this part of this council resolution and spending of those overtime dollars. Maybe that's a different conversation for us to have. But you know, I'm all for you guys wanting to dive deeper into, if we're going to have these things, who's paying for them? Are we getting them for free? Are we going to pay for them ourselves? And then, you know, just to frame the conversation, I do think that there's a time where the image that we want is an aggressive image, right? I just like Marco said, yeah, I don't want our guys showing up to family violence calls with a rifle slung on their chest, right? One of the worst calls that I've responded to in my 14 years as a police officer is the sexual assault of a child, you know, where I sat down in someone's living room and listened to a grandmother give me the outcry of her grandson talking about being sexually assaulted. Like, I recognize that the father in me recognizes that in that moment, I need to be as soft and as tender for that family as I can be. So yeah, you know, I want our people to be dressed appropriately. I want our people to have the appropriate stance, but I also recognize that there are bad people in this world. Our Bearcat, right? Our armored vehicle that our SWAT officers use has been shot twice, you know? So at least on 2 occasions, we have somebody within our community that's willing to use deadly force to actively target our police officers. And I will maintain that there are moments within our very, very safe city that we do need an aggressive image, that we do need these aggressive tools so people understand that we take crime seriously and that we are going to invest in the safety of our police officers.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, it's the challenge for us moving forward in the conversation is not assuming every example or question is every call is that thing. And when we start to dig into in these future workshops, you know, dig into what these 911 calls are and how do they break down in different types of calls, that'll help us better refine kind of budget decisions and service delivery that can meet the need to the type of call. And again, you know, it's always, these conversations are always a challenge because the language we use is so easily misinterpreted. You know, when you're a politician, you're kind of trained in how to say things in a way that most people can. Well, I don't know. There are politicians now that don't seem to care about that, but at least the ones in Austin seem to care about trying to say things that people can understand, and that's always a challenge moving forward. And the budget question, I know it's come up a couple times. Certainly the council's dug into overtime in all of our public safety departments, and there'll be a time in the future to dig into that again as we get into kind of these creative and alternative solutions. Ms. Pinon, did you want to add something?
Yes, one thing to add and just a point to clarify, the overtime budget, the reason I even broke it out was just the $2.2 million number that I gave to you. I just wanted to be clear that it may not be that all that amount went to spending on military grade weapons. right? That was the point of breaking it out. One thing that I do want to raise in the short amount of time that we have is how you see this connection between this militarization of police, but also the use, which is now in this resolution prohibited, right? No-knock warrants. In terms of like, how are we using our SWAT team, which would be deployed with military gear? In that study that we did, 79% of the incidents that we studied involved the use of SWAT teams to search a person's home. And of those, 60% of the cases were searching for drugs. So I think that data just raises the question of, is that how we want to be using military grade weaponry and show of force? I of course would say no, but I think it's an important point to raise, like, how are we deploying it right now, oftentimes and across the country? I'm not saying it's only in Austin, right? It's used to search homes. Is that where we should be focusing?
And, it's not going to be easy in this conversation to delineate when a national study is describing a police tactic that we don't do in Austin, but more generally that there's a national data point that says X. And in some cases, we don't do that here. In some cases, maybe it's happened on rare occasion. Hard to get into that level of detail in this conversation. Ms. Laurin.
Thanks. I want to connect this to sort of, again, a bigger picture framing, partly because we're close to the end. We might not get to everything, and what I have to say is kind of cross-cutting. I think that, go back to the big picture question I started with. The really essential question is, what do we want police to be doing? What are the harms that we see that are created when they're doing that, right? And can we bear them? And I think that, beyond the label of militarization, there are important questions to ask along those dimensions, right? Do we want police to be doing this function? If we do, what do they really need to be doing it, right? And how important is that function such that we can bear the harms? But there's a sort of flip side aspect to this too. I think it would be a mistake to focus so much on, equipment issues or very specific tactic issues and sort of miss the sort of broader questions about how should police interact with the community? How should they think about when force is necessary and what level it should be? Because the risk is creating sort of a whack-a-mole problem, right? If one sees, harm in the results of the way in which we think a SWAT team shows up to a particular home, right? And if we take care of that harm by saying no more militarized equipment, well, it's easy enough to get other stuff, and it's easy enough for the encounter to be equally damaging, right? Without a tank outside, you just have like cars, but everyone's kind of rushing in the same way, right? If that's what we think is happening. And I'm not saying that SWAT teams are rushing in bad ways, but what I'm saying is, if we think that there are ways in which policing can be improved tactically, and in which we think that we can better optimize kind of the relationship between the individuals who are being policed and the police. Focusing too much on equipment, right, as opposed to those other things, really risks missing the essential kind of solutions to those problems.
Thank you, Ms. Laurin. And I think that's a good place for us to kind of offer some wrap-up opportunities for our panelists. There are a couple of items in the resolution we didn't get to with a specific conversation, no-knock warrants, facial recognition, and acoustic devices. And there's probably a longer conversation to have on the no-knock warrants, but I think facial recognition and acoustic has been relatively fleshed out as inappropriate, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of disagreement on those points. But I want to offer to any of our panelists an opportunity to take a minute or two and just provide some wrap-up comments. Ms. Laurin, I thought you did a great job providing your wrap-up comments, and I'm going to consider them your wrap-up comments, if that's okay. Officer Jackson.
Just real quick, just coming from a girl from the hood, I grew up in a really rough environment. With drugs comes violence, and that's a fact. Not only as an officer do I know this, but I know this as a person that grew up in violence, in gangbanging, being shot at, being put a gun at me because I was in the wrong neighborhood with the wrong colors. So it is definitely there. And, you know, in order to become something more productive in society, it's not to bash the police or think that police is worse. It's to recruit the community, make them become, because what better way of becoming an officer and being proud of where you're from than representing your community. That's where it needs to start. Recruiting within the community, showing these kids that there is potential, that there is something that they can do with their lives.
Thank you, Officer Jackson. Anyone else like to provide some final comments? Sergeant Crumrine.
Thank you. So, Ms. Laurin, I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what you had said. I agree with you 100%. As the old dog here, the guy who's been for 33 plus years doing this job and starting out in my career where I had what we affectionately called was a wheel gun, which is an old revolver. I started my career with that until now, just to kind of give you a frame of reference. I agree 100% that we need to expand this conversation to look at what is it that the community here in Austin expects out of their law enforcement. Fortunately, unfortunately, whatever the case may be, law enforcement has kind of become the junk drawer for everything that a lot of people don't want to have to deal with in society. And they've asked us to be the ones to try to fix it. And there's many things that we're really, really good at. I will be the first one to tell you there are things we are not good at and we can be better. But if we can really focus on exactly what you're talking about in that, where do you want us to put our attention? Where exactly should that lie? And then let's be the very best that we can be at that. Is that working in intimate partner violence or homicide or crimes against persons or robberies or whatever? Give us those guidelines and let us do the job that we know that we can do incredibly well. And obviously, in a 2-hour session, we can't talk about everything. We can't even begin to scratch the surface on no-knock warrants or the SWAT team showing up or whichever the case may be and how that looks or how that presents. You know, and Anna said it great, you know, in regards to she is an individual. She is a daughter of this community. Austin is her mother. I mean, this is how she came to be. And she is a powerful voice. We need to listen to those voices, but we really need to get and have some honest conversations about what do we do moving forward in our community and what is that going to look like. And I think we can come together. We're smart enough and we're gifted and we're talented enough that we can give you the type of police force that all of us will continue to be incredibly proud of. This is a profession I have dedicated my entire life to. I absolutely love this profession. But I've seen the good that this profession can do. I'm not saying it doesn't have faults, and I'm not saying it can't be better. But collaboratively having conversations like this where you're talking to the people that do the job every single day, not necessarily the people with all the stars and bars on, that's where I think you're really going to start making the progress that's necessary to give the community what they expect and frankly what they deserve in their police force. And so thank you for coming along those lines with what you had to say, because I agree with you. This is a much more expansive conversation we need to have over a period of time.
Thank you, Sergeant. Corporal Johnson.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of what Sergeant Crumrine said. I think at the end of the day, I realize, and I'm glad that we all come here collectively with open minds, but we have to remember that we serve at the will of the people in this community, and we have to be mindful of our impact, but also we want to hear from our community. We want them to dive into what we're doing and say, hey, can we do this a different way? Or is this a good tactic? Or is there a better way to do this? Because that allows us to expand our resources and find better ways to grow as a police department. I'll say that during my time here, maturity is what's helped me grow into the officer that I am. Just doing this job and understanding there's much more to just putting cuffs on someone. There's much more to going out there and stopping a vehicle, interacting with people, connecting with them, getting them to understand and understanding where they're coming from. Those are all important pieces, and we have to be mindful that we have to move forward not only just as a department and only as a community, but as a collective to continue to affect some type of change.
Thank you, Corporal. Any other comments? Officer Villareal.
I know we're out of time. I just want to thank you, Jimmy, again for including us in the conversation. It means a lot to me as the vice president of the APA to be a part of these conversations, and I especially want to thank the 4 panelists from the community. I know sometimes people shy away from these conversations because, like you've said earlier, they're difficult to have at times, and I consistently tell folks that the better that I can understand where someone else is coming from, and the better that they can understand where I'm coming from, the closer to meeting each other in the middle we can get as a community. So just on behalf of the APA, I thank you for including us.
Thank you, Officer. Any other final comments? Any of the committee members wish to make any comments? Pretend I see you've got your camera on.
No, I really appreciate the very honest conversation that we're having, and I think it's just the beginning. Very, very interesting. Everything that everybody said, hearing all the perspectives in this is going to be so important. And I'll give my perspective in that what I have heard is we do need to rethink how we respond, and I don't think that is negative for anyone. It's been an incredibly tough position for me, and I've said before, because I come from public safety. You, Mr. Crumrine, you said that you were in the police academy at 9/11. I was in the fire academy at 9/11, so you may have run up the tower a couple times with each other. And so I think, I don't know how we're getting there as this committee. It's an important first step. For Officer Jackson, I 100% agree with you. But I think from my perspective, we have used the criminal justice system to solve drug use problems and to solve violence that happens in neighborhoods because of that. And for me, this is rethinking how we reallocate limited resources to maybe solve those other problems, so we're not sending police officers in there. So we're getting to those issues, and those are going to be tough things to get to. Drug use and why we get to drug use. Families that have families that are in prison. Children being raised by their grandparents or single moms, and the difficulties that Latino and African American communities face. And so, it's this big, broad issue we're trying to solve here. And your perspectives are so important, because I really feel like we could sit down with our police officers and probably you could tell us so many calls that you don't think you even should have been called to. And I know that I felt that sometimes as a firefighter, why is someone trained with my training in this situation right now? You mentioned, Officer Villareal, the talking to a grandmother about her grandson being sexually assaulted. Is that with the training that our police officers, is that the type of position we should be sending to those kinds of things? I love what Ms. Laurin said, is that it's a broad conversation of how we decide what our response is. And I think that's the difficult decision. There's always going to be bad things that happen, and we need to know how to respond to those appropriately. But for me, it's right sizing. I'll just say last really quickly. we have done this before. We have changed how we respond to things before. We created a code compliance department. That's law enforcement, because we thought we don't need to send police officers because a neighbor's mad about my neighbor's fence being too close, or a neighbor's mad about I didn't get a permit for my roof. We created a different, people that get parking tickets. We've created a different, law enforcement for that. It's my understanding that our law enforcement used to do the like stray dogs a long time ago, that APD used to do that kind of response. Now you don't do that anymore. So like this, for me, this isn't like some out of the blue thing that we have never done before. We have done this before. We have recreated our response and right-sized our response. And I think we're just working off that again. Like EMS used to send 2 paramedics to every call. Now it's not always 2 paramedics. We've, when it comes to what the response is, what the situation is, what our fiscal situation is, we've done this before, and I'm confident that we can do it again, and I'm grateful for these very honest conversations.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. If there are no other comments, then I'll just close by thanking all of our panelists, Ms. Pinon, Ms. Laurin, Ms. Agrawal, Mr. Webb, and our officers, Officer Jackson, Corporal Johnson, Sergeant Crumrine, and Officer Villareal. Thank you so much for engaging in a challenging conversation, one that is broadcast to our community on television and live stream. Is not easy to do. Councilwoman Madison, did you want to add anything? Just turned on your camera.
Nothing at all. I just wanted to make sure I'm echoing the sentiment of the gratitude for the conversation and the people who participated, but I just figured it'd probably be a good look as we close, as I am on the committee, to have my face show. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Councilmember. And for the members of the public who are watching this, as I started this conversation, we were not going to answer difficult questions today. Those questions are going to continue to be worked out. There are a lot of questions about how we're going to move this community into a place where both our first responders of all kinds are meeting the need of the community where the community is, and that the tactics are reflecting the will of the public, as Corporal Johnson so eloquently said. I am excited to continue this work. As chair of the Public Safety Committee, I commit to you, and I know my colleagues agree, we will continue to have these challenging conversations in public. We will continue to invite officers and the folks who are actually doing the work to the conversation, in addition to community experts. Thank you, everybody, for spending your time with us today. And with that, at 4:09 p.m., I adjourn this meeting of the Public Safety Committee. Thank you.
My friends call me Scratch. You people I sigh and mighty, thinking your guys pride and joy. It's just a symbol from boxcars and put together like tinker toys. Oh,